The September 11th attacks were the deadliest terrorist attacks in U.S. history. They changed the world in a single morning. On September 11, 2001, 4 passenger planes were hijacked. The attacks took place in the United States. 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. Both towers caught fire. Within hours, they collapsed. A 3rd plane hit the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. Part of the building was destroyed. The 4th plane crashed in Pennsylvania. Passengers fought back. The plane never reached its target. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. Thousands more were injured. Victims came from many countries. Air travel across the U.S. was shut down. Cities went silent. The nation was in shock. Investigators quickly identified the attackers. They were linked to Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. The group had planned the attacks for years. The U.S. government responded with force. A global war on terrorism began. New security laws were passed. Airports changed forever. Surveillance increased. Foreign policy shifted. The attacks reshaped global politics. Wars followed in the Middle East. Millions of lives were affected. Every year, the victims are remembered. Memorials stand in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. September 11th remains a symbol of loss and change. The Lockerbie bombing was one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history. It shocked the world and changed air travel forever. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 took off from London. The plane was flying to New York City. There were 259 people on board. About 38 minutes after takeoff, the plane exploded in mid-air. The wreckage fell over the town of Lockerbie, Scotland. Debris rained down on homes and streets. All 259 passengers and crew were killed. Families were destroyed in seconds. Investigators quickly suspected a bomb. The explosion came from inside the cargo hold. A small device had been hidden in luggage. The investigation took years. Evidence was collected from thousands of pieces. Bits of a timer were later recovered. The trail led to Libya. 2 Libyan intelligence officers were accused. The case caused major international tension. One suspect was put on trial. In 2001, Abdul Basit al-Megrahi was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. Years later, he was released due to illness. This decision caused anger and debate. Many families felt justice was incomplete. Baggage checks became stricter. International rules were tightened. Today, Lockerbie is remembered with memorials. The names of the victims are preserved. The tragedy still echoes through aviation history. Pan Am Flight 103 remains a reminder. Small security failures can lead to massive loss, and the impact can last for generations. The Air India Flight 182 bombing was one of the deadliest attacks in aviation history. It happened quietly, far from land, but the impact was massive. On June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182 took off from Canada. The plane was flying to India, with a stop in London. There were 329 people on board. About an hour before landing, the plane exploded over the Atlantic Ocean. It broke apart in mid-air. No one survived. Most of the victims were Canadian citizens. Many were families and children. The loss shocked the country. Investigators soon confirmed a bomb caused the explosion. The device had been hidden in checked luggage. It was triggered mid-flight. The investigation pointed to extremists based in Canada. The attack was linked to political violence. The planning took place over many months. The case moved slowly. Evidence was complex. Key warnings had been missed. Years later, arrests were made. Trials followed. Only one man was convicted. Many families felt justice came too late. Some felt it never fully came. The case raised serious questions. The bombing led to changes in airport security. Baggage screening improved. Intelligence sharing increased. For years, the tragedy received little attention. It was later recognized as a major act of terrorism. Canada now marks it as a national tragedy. Air India Flight 182 is remembered for its loss, and for the lessons learned too late. A reminder of the cost of ignored warnings. The crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 was the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. It remains one of the most shocking disasters in aviation. On August 12, 1985, Flight 123 left Tokyo for Osaka. The plane was a Boeing 747. There were 524 people on board. Shortly after takeoff, a loud bang was heard. The aircraft lost pressure. Control systems began to fail. The pilot struggled to keep the plane in the air. They fought for over 30 minutes. Passengers sensed something was wrong. The plane flew in wide circles. It climbed and dropped repeatedly. Inside the cabin, panic spread. Eventually, the aircraft crashed into a mountain ridge. It happened in a remote area of Japan. The impact was devastating. 520 people were killed. Only 4 passengers survived. The scale of loss stunned the nation. Investigators found the cause years earlier. A faulty repair had weakened the plane's structure. The rear pressure wall failed mid-flight. The disaster exposed serious safety failures. Maintenance standards were reviewed. Airline oversight changed worldwide. Rescue efforts were also questioned. Survivors might have lived longer. Response delays raised concerns. In Japan, the crash left deep scars. Families mourned in silence. Memorials were built near the site. Flight 123 is remembered every year. It stands as a warning. Small errors can lead to unimaginable loss. The tragedy reshaped aviation safety, and it remains a painful lesson in accountability. The explosion of TWA Flight 800 was one of the most mysterious air disasters in U.S. history. It raised questions that lasted for years. On July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 took off from New York. The plane was flying to Paris. There were 230 people on board. About 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane exploded in midair. Witnesses saw a flash in the sky. Debris fell into the Atlantic Ocean. All 230 passengers and crew were killed. The nation was stunned. Families demanded answers. At first, many feared terrorism. The crash happened during a tense time. Investigators treated it as a possible attack. A massive investigation followed. Wreckage was pulled from the ocean. Thousands of pieces were examined. After years of study, officials reached a conclusion. The explosion came from the center fuel tank. Fuel vapors had ignited. A spark likely caused the blast. Wiring near the tank was suspected. No bomb was found. The final report ruled out terrorism. Still, doubts remained for some. The case stayed controversial. The crash led to safety changes. Fuel tank designs were improved. New rules were put in place. TWA Flight 800 changed aviation safety. It showed hidden risks inside modern aircraft and how hard answers can be to find. The victims are remembered each year. Their names are honored, and the lessons continue to guide air travel today. The crash of EgyptAir Flight 990 remains one of the most debated air disasters in history. Its cause is still disputed today. On October 31, 1999, EgyptAir Flight 990 took off from New York. The plane was flying to Cairo. There were 217 people on board. About 30 minutes after takeoff, the plane suddenly changed course. It climbed, then dropped sharply. Controllers lost contact soon after. The aircraft crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. All passengers and crew were killed. Families were left without answers. Investigators began a long and complex review. The plane showed no signs of mechanical failure at first. Weather was not a factor. U.S. investigators suggested deliberate action. They pointed to flight data and cockpit recordings. One relief pilot was mentioned in the report. Egyptian officials strongly disagreed. They argued a technical problem caused the crash. The disagreement became public. Two official conclusions were released. Each side stood by its findings. No single explanation was accepted by all. The crash raised questions about cockpit access. Mental health checks were reviewed. International safety talks followed. Airlines later adjusted crew rules. Monitoring systems improved. Communication standards were updated. For families, closure never fully came. The debate added to their pain. Answers remained divided. EgyptAir Flight 990 is remembered for loss and uncertainty, a tragedy shaped by facts and conflict, and a reminder that not all disasters find clear answers. The Munich massacre was one of the darkest moments in Olympic history. It showed how global events could become targets. In September 1972, the Olympic Games were held in Munich, Germany. Athletes from around the world came to compete. The mood was peaceful and hopeful. Early one morning, armed attackers entered the Olympic Village. They targeted the Israeli team. Several athletes were taken hostage. The attackers made demands. They wanted prisoners released. Negotiations began and lasted for hours. The world watched live on television. Millions followed every update. Tension kept rising. A rescue attempt was planned at an airport, but it was poorly prepared. Communication failed. Gunfire broke out. Explosions followed. The situation collapsed. By the end, 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were killed. A police officer also died. The loss shocked the world. The Olympic Games were stopped briefly. Memorials were held. Grief spread across nations. The massacre changed global security forever. Sporting events were no longer seen as safe by default. Protection became essential. Counter-terror units were created. Security planning became stricter. Intelligence sharing improved. The Munich massacre became a symbol of innocence lost and the high cost of unpreparedness. It is remembered not for sport, but for tragedy, a reminder that peace requires protection, and vigilance matters. The Dawson's field hijackings were a major turning point in aviation security. They showed how vulnerable air travel had become. In September 1970, multiple passenger planes were hijacked. The attacks were carried out by a militant group. The targets were international flights. 3 planes were forced to land in a remote desert area in Jordan. This place became known as Dawson's Field. Passengers were taken hostage. Another hijacked plane landed elsewhere. The situation unfolded over several days. The world watched closely. Most passengers were eventually released, but the crisis did not end there. The planes were still under control. In front of cameras, the hijackers destroyed the empty aircraft. Large explosions lit up the desert. The images spread around the world. The goal was political pressure. Hostages were used as leverage. Governments were forced to negotiate. The hijackings caused global shock. They exposed weak airport security. Weapons had been brought on board with ease. After Dawson's Field, changes came quickly. Airlines strengthened cockpit rules. Passenger screening expanded. Metal detectors became common. Baggage checks improved. International cooperation increased. New laws were passed to fight hijacking. Air marshals were introduced on some flights. Security became a priority. The Dawson's Field hijackings marked the end of a careless era. They reshaped how the world protects air travel, and they remain a key lesson in aviation history. Swissair Flight 330 was a tragic event that shocked the world. It was one of the deadliest airline crashes in Swiss history. On March 21, 1970, Swissair Flight 330 took off from Zurich, Switzerland. The plane was headed to New York City, with 47 people on board. The flight was routine, with no signs of trouble at first. About 35 minutes into the flight, disaster struck. The plane suddenly lost altitude. It crashed into a forested area near the town of Renlingen, Switzerland. Rescue teams quickly arrived, but there were no survivors. All 47 people aboard, including passengers and crew, were killed. The wreckage was scattered over a wide area. Investigators quickly began looking into the cause. It was soon determined that the crash was caused by a bomb. The explosion had been placed in the plane's cargo hold. The attack was linked to terrorism, although the exact motives remained unclear. There was speculation about political or ideological reasons behind the bombing. The tragedy raised serious concerns about airline security. Swissair, like many airlines, had very few security measures at the time. Airport screenings were not as strict as they would be later. The bombing of Flight 330 led to immediate changes. Luggage screening was improved, and security measures were tightened across the aviation industry. The event became a key moment in the history of aviation safety. Swissair Flight 330 is remembered for its loss of life and its lasting impact on air travel. The attack showed the vulnerability of civilian flights and highlighted the need for stronger protections. The bombing of Metrojet Flight 9268 was the deadliest air disaster in Russian aviation history. It showed how terrorism could reach civilian flights. On October 31, 2015, Metrojet Flight 9268 took off from Egypt. The plane was flying to Russia. There were 224 people on board. About 23 minutes after takeoff, the plane broke apart in midair. It crashed over the Sinai Peninsula. No one survived. Most of the passengers were tourists. Families were returning home. The loss shocked Russia. At first, officials were unsure of the cause. Weather and technical issues were considered, but evidence soon pointed elsewhere. Investigators found signs of an explosion. A bomb had been placed on the aircraft. It was hidden in the cargo area. A militant group later claimed responsibility. The attack was linked to terrorism. Security failures were exposed. Flights to Egypt were suspended. Airport screening was reviewed. Security rules were tightened. The crash led to major changes. Baggage checks improved. Staff vetting became stricter. Memorials were held across Russia. Victims were honored publicly. The tragedy left deep pain. Metrojet Flight 9268 became a warning. Civil aviation remains a target, and security gaps can be deadly. The disaster reshaped travel policy, and it remains a painful lesson in modern aviation safety. The shootdown of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was one of the most shocking air disasters of the 21st century. It happened in the middle of an active conflict. On July 17, 2014, Flight 17 took off from Amsterdam. The plane was flying to Kuala Lumpur. There were 298 people on board. As the aircraft flew over eastern Ukraine, it suddenly disappeared from radar. The plane was cruising at high altitude. There was no distress call. The aircraft broke apart in midair. Wreckage fell across fields and villages. No one survived. Victims came from many countries. Most were from the Netherlands. Families were devastated. Investigators soon suspected a missile strike. The region was controlled by armed groups. Heavy weapons were present. Evidence pointed to a surface-to-air missile. It had been launched from the ground. The weapon was designed for military targets. An international investigation followed. Wreckage was carefully collected. Flight data was analyzed. The findings concluded the plane was shot down by mistake. The missile system came from Russia. Responsibility became a global dispute. Political tensions increased. Sanctions were expanded. Relations between countries worsened. Families demanded justice. Courts were involved years later. Some suspects were convicted in absentia. Flight paths over conflict zones were reviewed. Airspace rules were tightened. Airlines changed routing decisions. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 became a symbol. Civilian travel caught in war. And the high cost of miscalculation. The tragedy is remembered each year. Names are read aloud, and the loss still echoes worldwide. The hijacking of EgyptAir Flight 426 was a major moment in aviation security history. It showed how political violence could reach civilian air travel. On July 23, 1968, EgyptAir Flight 426 took off from Rome. The plane was flying to Tel Aviv. There were 38 passengers and crew on board. Shortly after takeoff, the plane was hijacked. Armed attackers took control of the cockpit. They forced the aircraft to change course. The plane was flown to Algiers. Passengers were held hostage. The situation quickly became international news. Most non-Israeli passengers were released. Israeli passengers and crew were kept longer. They were used as bargaining tools. Negotiations lasted for weeks. Governments became involved. Tension remained high. Eventually, prisoner exchange was arranged. The hostages were released safely. No passengers were killed. The hijacking shocked airlines around the world. It exposed how easy it was to seize a plane. Security at airports was very weak. After this incident, EgyptAir changed its policies. Armed guards were placed on flights. Passenger screening became stricter. Other airlines soon followed. Governments began taking hijacking seriously. New rules were discussed. The EgyptAir Flight 426 hijacking marked a shift. Air travel was no longer seen as safe by default. Protection became a priority. This event helped shape modern aviation security. Cockpit access was controlled. Pre-flight checks became standard. EgyptAir Flight 426 is remembered as a turning point, a crisis without loss of life, and a lesson that changed how the world flies. The hijacking of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 was one of the most dramatic and tragic events in aviation history. It ended in disaster, but also highlighted the power of quick thinking in extreme situations. On November 23, 1996, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 took off from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The plane was headed to Nairobi, Kenya, with 175 people on board. Shortly after takeoff, 3 hijackers took control of the aircraft. They were armed and demanded to be flown to Australia. However, the plane did not have enough fuel to make the long journey. The plane began flying toward the Indian Ocean. The crew worked to try to stop the hijackers. At one point, the plane began running out of fuel and lost altitude. The crew tried to land the aircraft safely in the ocean near the Comoros Islands. The impact was violent. Many passengers and crew were killed instantly. There were 50 survivors. They were rescued from the wreckage by nearby fishermen, many of them injured. The hijackers did not survive. They had used the hostages as leverage, but their plan ended in failure. The attack was later linked to political motives, but the full reasons behind the hijacking were never entirely clear. The crash of Flight 961 led to changes in aviation security. It showed that even small weaknesses in airport security could lead to tragedy. New rules were put in place to prevent hijackings and improve safety measures. The survivors, while deeply affected by the trauma, were fortunate to be rescued. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 will always be remembered for the lives lost and the lessons learned about aviation safety. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. A modern jet vanished without warning. On March 8, 2014, Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur. The plane was flying to Beijing. There were 239 people on board. Less than an hour after takeoff, communication stopped. The aircraft turned off its transponder. No distress call was made. Radar later showed the plane changing course. It flew away from its planned route. Then it vanished completely. Search efforts began immediately. Multiple countries joined the mission. The search covered vast areas of ocean. Weeks turned into months. No clear wreckage was found at first. Families waited in pain. Satellite data suggested the plane flew for hours. It likely ended in the Indian Ocean. The exact location remained unknown. Small pieces of debris were later discovered. They matched the aircraft model, but they did not solve the mystery. Investigators explored many theories. Mechanical failure, human action. No answer was confirmed. The search became the most expensive in aviation history. Still, the main wreckage was never found. Questions remain unanswered. Flight 370 changed aviation tracking. New rules were discussed. Planes became easier to follow. For families, closure never came. For the world, the mystery remains. A reminder that even modern systems can fail. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is remembered for absence, a tragedy defined by silence, and a search without an ending. The Entebbe Operation, also called Operation Thunderbolt, was one of the most successful rescues in history. It showed how quick action and careful planning can save lives. On June 27, 1976, Air France Flight 139 took off from Tel Aviv, Israel. The plane was headed to Paris, France, with 248 passengers on board. While in the air, the plane was hijacked by 4 terrorists from the Palestinian group, FLP. They forced the plane to land in Entebbe, Uganda. Once on the ground, the hijackers made demands. They wanted the release of prisoners held in Israel. They threatened to kill the passengers if their demands were not met. The hostages were held at the airport terminal. The hijackers received support from Ugandan leader Idi Amin. The world watched, waiting for a solution. Israeli officials started planning a rescue. They gathered information and prepared for a risky mission. The hostages were still in danger as talks dragged on for days. On July 4, 1976, Israel decided to act. A team of Israeli commandos called Sayeret Matkal launched a surprise attack. They stormed the airport, catching the hijackers off guard. The mission was quick and precise. The commandos freed all the hostages in just 90 minutes. They killed all the hijackers and rescued 102 hostages. Sadly, one Israeli soldier, Yonatan Netanyahu, was killed during the mission. He was the older brother of future Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The operation was a success. It showed that a well-planned military operation could save lives even in a crisis. It also sent a clear message: Israel would fight back against terrorism. The Entebbe Operation is still remembered today. It is a symbol of courage, quick thinking, and bravery. The mission is one of the most famous rescue operations in history.